The recording. Okay, welcome to our October meeting. I hope you're all dry and safe. I'll turn it over to Dawn. Thank you, Dawn.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the wet, rainy October meeting. We're going to talk about winter because that is what we're having right now. Let me get my slideshow going correctly. There we go. So you can see it a little better. And let me minimize my screen here. So if you have questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat, and we'll try and take care of those as best we can. So we're actually, if you haven't overwintered yet, then you're going to want to do this in the next week or so, because we really are on the tail end and full on into winter now. The US Bee Informed Survey did a study, and it showed that that there are three conditions that determine the success of overwintering hives. And the first one is having adequate food in the hive. And we're going to go through each of these separately as a topic on a slide. So they need to have adequate food, and they need to have strong, healthy colonies with enough bees to get through the winter. And they have to have moisture control, which is a big deal in the Northwest. So we'll cover that a little bit later. So the three things, if you only master three things for winter, it's those three: lots of food, strong, healthy colonies, big colonies, and moisture control. Additional things that are good for winter are mouse guards, and you can see down on the lower right of the screen here, this is a really easy mouse guard. You don't have to go out and buy expensive pieces from Man Lake. You can literally take, this is 1/4-inch screen. It's big enough to let the bees come and go, but small enough so that a mouse can't get through. And you literally just staple it in front of there. And if you don't have an entrance reducer, you can put a brick or something to kind of on top of the wire to kind of reduce that entrance down a little bit for winter. So there's pretty easy things you can do that don't cost a lot. You want to make sure to strap down your hives or put a brick or a big rock on the cover, because out here in the Skagit Valley, the winds are up to 30 miles an hour tonight, and that is enough to blow the cover off of your hive and get your bees all wet. So make sure that you've got a heavy rock or a strap around there to keep. And the other thing that's nice about the weight on it is it kind of helps compress the seams of the hive together a little bit better and makes it just a little more airtight. It makes less area that they have to propolize. And if you're in a really windy area, you can put a windbreak up. You can use hay bales, anything kind of large and blocky that you can put in front of them to kind of block some of the wind. If you have your entrances reduced down pretty small, just a little entrance on the top and a little entrance on the bottom, you probably don't need to worry about the wind too much. But if you've got your entrances wide open and they're facing the wind, you want to try and block that just a little bit. So the first thing that we want to be able to do in winter is having lots of food on the colony. Now, ideally, the best food is always honey, but dry sugar works as well. Actually, I'm going to back up. That's winter. I'm going to back up to fall. The things that we should have been doing that I'm hoping everybody did during the fall is in the fall, late August through October, I actually just took the syrup off my hives a couple days ago. Yeah. You want to feed them 2-to-1 syrup. And what they can do is they can bring that into the hive and they can make it into honey really fast. So it's a winter store. But then when the daytime highs are down in the 50s, then you want to take the syrup feeders off. But what I do is I start putting syrup on them as soon as I take the honey supers off. If they don't have 10 frames of honey, I start putting sugar in there just to make sure that they've got enough to get through the winter. So you can start September. It takes them about a month to cure the honey down in the Northwest. So if they're light on food stores and they're a small colony, then you just want to start feeding them right when the blackberries are done, and just keep feeding them all the way until we get into this 50-degree weather here. So then when we get into the 50-degree weather, there's a couple of reasons we take the feeders off. One is they're cold and they're wet and they hold moisture, and they put a lot of moisture in the hive, and they're harder to keep warm. So we want to get the water out of the hive, and we want to give them things that will help to absorb the moisture out of the hive. So for food, Robbie, could you mute? For inside of the hive, capped honey is the best.
You're muted, Dawn.
There we go. Everybody muted, so now I'm on mute. Thank you. Thank you, Kit, though, for doing that.
Sorry.
They need 8 to 10 frames of capped honey in order to get through the winter. If they don't have 8 to 10 frames of capped honey, then you're going to need to supplement with dry sugar to make sure they have enough food for the winter. There's a couple ways to do that. You can directly on top of the frames, you open the hive and there's the frames with bees on them. You can put a sheet of newspaper down, and you take a bag of sugar and you pour sugar onto the newspaper. And that will give them food to eat during the winter. They will chew through the newspaper and they will get up there and they will be able to eat that sugar. And the other thing that the sugar does is it sucks up the water. So it pulls a lot of water out of the hive. So even if my bees have enough honey in them, I oftentimes put a little sugar in there anyway, just for a little extra insurance, and because it helps to pull moisture out of the hive. You can also make sugar blocks, just giant sugar cubes. You take a bowl of dry sugar and you sprinkle water in it until it just barely holds a snowball, until it just barely holds shape. And then you pat it into a cookie sheet or something that's been lined with plastic. And the nice thing about the sugar cubes in the middle of winter, if you peek in there and they're running low on food, you can just slip a sugar cube in there without having to take the whole lid off and pour more sugar on. And also, if you're using dry sugar on top of newspaper, if you go to add more sugar, you have to put more newspaper on top, because they eat little holes in the newspaper, and when you pour the dry sugar on, it pours through the holes. So if you're using newspaper, put a second layer on every time you put more food on. You can also purchase fondant from Man Lake. It's kind of expensive. I think I did the first year because I didn't know how else to feed them. There are really a lot less expensive ways to feed the bees than buying sugar patties. They call them winter patties. I try not to put any pollen in my colonies until Valentine's Day. The pollen does not burn through the bees cleanly, and it makes them feel full of poop. They have to poop after they eat protein. And when it's so cold, they don't get to go out and do the cleansing flights. So they can wind up kind of having to have a long time between cleansing flights. The sugar burns really cleanly. They're not required to leave the hive to go cleanse any of the sugar out. And the protein is really mostly used for rearing brood. They need it that's why when you see pollen coming in on the bees, when they're coming in the entrance, then they're rearing brood, because they're pulling in lots and lots of pollen. So in times when they're close to broodless, you don't have to add pollen patties. Okay, so now we're going to talk about strength of colonies. So a strong colony has a low mite load, lots of bees, and minimal excess space. That's kind of what you want for the bees going into winter. So hopefully you've been testing and treating for your mites. The number one thing that kills bees is starvation. The number two thing that kills bees, the number two things that kills bees is mites. So you want to make sure that we just covered the food. It is a little too late if you haven't been treating your bees at this point to put any of the other treatments on them except oxalic acid. Hey, Ashley, can you mute? And Kit, at any time, it's okay to mute everybody and I'll just pop back in. So it's
Okay.
a little less distracting. The thing that you can treat with this time of year is oxalic acid, a vaporizer, not dribble. It's too late in the year to do dribble, but if you've got one of those paddle oxalic acid vaporizers or the oxy vape things, those are fine to use and can help keep the varroa mites knocked down. So low mite load, lots of bees. You want to think of what a nuke looks like when you first get it in the spring. It's 5 frames packed with bees. That's what a springtime colony needs in order to build up. If it has less than that, it's not going to build up very well in the spring. Winter bees, you need at least 6 frames of bees so that you can get that attrition going and they still have enough bees to stay warm. If you have colonies that have fewer than 6 frames, and actually how you count a frame of bees is if you look at this top picture, that is 10 full frames of bees. There's bees between every seam, there's bees on top, that's 10 frames of bees. If there were empty frames on each side with no bees on them, then you wouldn't count those as frames of bees. And it actually varies depending on the weather. They're going to spread out a little more in the warm weather. It's going to look like more bees. They're going to crunch up a little tighter in the colder weather. So it's kind of it's a bit of a squishy number, but 6 frames of bees is a good goal for winter. 10 or more is ideal. If you have, and again, I'm sorry, it's a little too late to do this now. unless you have really weak colonies, and then that might be your only option to save them. But if you have weak colonies with less than 5 frames of bees, you could go ahead and combine those. And the way you do that is you just put a sheet of newspaper on top of one colony and put the other colony on top of it. And they will chew through the newspaper. One of the queens will survive and the other one will not, but you will have a combined colony with more bees that will have the ability to keep the colony warm. And then you want to have minimal excess space. There's a little bit of debate here that people say, well, you know, they can, it doesn't matter the size of the box, it just matters the size of the cluster. And we'll see a little bit later the cluster, how the cluster stays warm. I have a preference for reducing the boxes as much as possible in the winter. So when I'm going through doing my winter inspection to plan for how I'm going to bring the hives through, I count how many frames of bees there are and how many frames of resources there are. That's brood, pollen, and honey is resources. And if there's 10 frames of bees and I only have 10 frames of resources, then I'm going to combine that hive down into a single box so that they're in there nice and snug and don't have a lot of extra space to keep warm or to build up kind of extra humidity around the sides. That's not, it doesn't always come out even like that, but it's good to try for. One thing that I try not to do is go into winter with undrawn frames. It's okay to have empty frames that have wax on them where they're drawn out, but where it's just plastic foundation, the bees can't use that. One of the ways they stay warm is the heater bees will go head first into that wax comb and they will vibrate and stay warm. And if I don't talk too long, you'll be able to, I have a slide on how they stay warm. So they really need that comb there to get in there and vibrate and stay warm right next to each other. The plastic foundation is just a lot of airspace that is harder for them to keep warm. They can't get in right next to each other. So if you've got a lot of undrawn frames in there, I like to put either a follower board in there, which is like a frame of foundation, except it has wood in the middle. It's just solid all the way through because it's like just thickening up the sides with extra wood. Or if you've got some of that pink insulation, I sometimes will just slide a piece of pink insulation in there to take up some of that space. Or you can also put a frame feeder in there, the kind that hangs like a frame inside of the box that you normally put syrup in, if you take the wood and the ladders out of that, you can pour that full of dry sugar. It will take up space in the colony. It will help insulate a little bit, and it will give them food and help pull some of the water out. So those are some options for kind of crunching that hive down so it stays nice and small and warm. So moisture control is really a big thing in the Northwest. They don't have to worry about it so much in places where it freezes a lot and they get snow and all that moisture comes out of the air. We are, 45 degrees and raining most winters. The prediction for this winter is just like last winter. So I think we're going to have an extra cold, snowy year again this year. So hopefully it's not as hard as on the bees in the spring. We got to have a better spring next year. But you want to be able to keep the bees warm. Dry bees can stay warm in temperatures below 20 degrees. Damp bees die of the cold at reasonable, not very low temperatures. They just need to stay dry. So what happens within the hive is there's a cluster of bees in there, and they're generating heat and warmth, which pulls moisture in. And that moisture evaporates up. It kind of chimneys up through the hive, and it goes all the way up to the outer cover, which is cold because it's touching the outside air. And that water condenses like on a glass of water on a hot day, and it forms droplets. And those droplets can rain down on the bees. So you want to try and find ways to keep that moisture off of the bees and pull as much moisture out of the colony as possible in our Northwest winters. A couple ways to do that is by putting things on top of the hive that help pull moisture out. So we talked about putting food on top. So you've got your frames, you've got your box with frames, and you've got some kind of sugar on top of that. On top of that goes some kind of moisture board. So it goes bees, food, moisture control. There's two options for moisture control. One is a board. It's called a homosote board, and it's a soundproofing board. You can buy it on Man Lake for about $10 a sheet, or you can get it at Home Depot for $29. And $29, you get 12 sheets of homosote. It's a bargain, and it takes a little work, but you can cut it up with a razor knife. You don't have to have power tools. It's a little easier with a saw. But it's very soft particle board, and it absorbs a lot of water. The moisture goes up into the homosote board, and then it wicks out the sides and evaporates. And this is my favorite way to keep them dry in the winter, because it also doesn't take a lot of storage, and I don't have to fiddle with putting chips in things. so that these moisture boards are pretty easy to do. But the other option is what's called a moisture quilt. And that's a box with holes on the side, so the moisture can evaporate out. It's got a screened bottom on it, and you fill the screened box with wood chips or pillow fluff or something like that. Cedar wood chips pine wood chips are probably the easiest thing in the Northwest. And I try to put burlap or something very open weave underneath the chips, because the way a quilt box works is the moisture goes up, and it actually goes all the way up through the chips. The chips don't absorb very much moisture because they're not super absorbent, but the moisture can flow through the chips, and then it hits that cold roof, and when it rains back down, the chips catch the water droplets. So you can actually lift the lid and reach in there and feel the top of it is wet in the winter. And then on warmer days, it evaporates out these side holes. So if you've got something like a really canvas or something that's really thick underneath the chips, it will absorb some of the water, but it will also block the effectiveness of the chips. Also, upper entrance is really good to have on your hives. If they only have one little tiny entrance, they're going to have a hard time circulating that air out so they can get that humid air out of the hive. You want to get some circulation in there to get the moisture out. If there is both a bottom entrance and a top entrance that actually really helps them to kind of circulate through and push out the wet air. And the wet air is going to be at the top, right? So that top entrance kind of lets that wet air push out. Let's see, and moving on. So this is what the frame configurations we want them to look like going into winter. So first we're going to talk about the frames, and then we're going to talk about the whole boxes. So in the winter, this is a FLIR, oh shoot, sorry. This is a FLIR camera. It's a heat camera that shows you kind of where the colony is. Now, some of this heat is probably rising. So the colony itself is, you know, in the middle of this bottom box. So when you arrange your hive, I actually start arranging the frames probably in late September, trying to get them into this configuration. And then I don't have to mess with them so much when the weather is cold out. So I make sure to get all of the brood and the capped brood and eggs down in the middle boxes. And don't worry if there isn't any. It's really not uncommon to not have any brood at all this time of year, but you want to get anything that looks like brood or brood frames down in the middle bottom. And then if you can, get nectar and pollen on the outside of that. And then you want to surround the whole thing with honey. And the reason is because honey has a great insulation quality. It will really help to keep them warm. So if you can put honey on the outside 1 or 2 frames of the bottom box, and then a complete lid of honey on top of that, it will give them food. It will help absorb some of the moisture, and it will help insulate them through the whole winter. One of the things that happens when the honey and the sugar absorb the moisture is it actually hydrates it, so the bees can lap it up and eat it more easily. Honey on its own is too thick for them to actually eat. They will actually go and forage for water on the inside walls of the box and bring that to the dry sugar or to the honey, and then take it, you know, they take droplets of water, get it in their honey stomach, and then they put it from the honey stomach onto the sugar or the honey to kind of liquefy it, and then they can lap that up and eat it. And then the configuration of the boxes in the winter. So I'm going to go from the bottom up on this picture on the right. So we're going to start always with a bottom board with a reduced entrance and a mouse guard. And then we've got what we saw in the last picture. We've got our cluster of bees in the bottom box, and we've got honey frames on top. And then on top of that, remember, it goes bees, and then food, and then insulation. I'm sorry, moisture. Bees, food, and moisture. And then on top of that, I like to put insulation. So inside of my outer cover, I always put a piece of styrofoam, because what that does is it helps hold the heat in and keep the top a little bit warmer. And I think that if the quilt or the homosoap board is a little bit warmer, then I think it evaporates a little better. So it's a little confusing to try and remember. Just remember, bees have to access their food, and they want to stay dry and warm. So that's the order it goes in. This is a deep inner cover. These are available on Man Lake. I am a huge fan of these. I have these on almost every one of my hives now. It's an inner cover that's about 2 inches deep. You can use them year round. So it's really, really valuable. You don't have to keep changing out inner covers. It's got a round hole for a jar feeder in the middle, which is really nice. So what I do in the winter, when I'm feeding my bees, is I take that jar lid out. So it's basically a deep inner cover with a round circle in the middle. And then I just dump dry sugar inside of this inner cover. And the bees, when they want to, they can come up through this hole and gather sugar and bring it back down. But it's just a really easy way to feed them with less equipment. So that's a nice thing to have. Oh, we're doing good on time. So I want to just talk briefly about how bees stay warm. So this is more intermediate, not so much beginner, but it's fun intermediate stuff. So the way the bees stay warm is there is a layer of bees on the outside of the cluster, and bunch themselves together really, really tightly. And it forms a barrier so the heat inside the cluster can't get out. And they kind of go into a little bit of a torpor. And then when they get too cold, they'll rotate in and another bee will work to the outside. So they kind of rotate out, taking the outside insulation core. And then inside of the core, there's two kinds of activities going on. One is heat generating and one is air circulation. So the heat generators, remember, will put their heads inside of comb, wax comb, and they will vibrate and they will generate heat by buzzing. And so you've got bees inside of the comb heating things, and then you've got bees between the comb fanning and flapping and circulating that air to try it. And that's kind of how we get the moisture out too, because they're circulating that hot air, which pushes the moisture out. Inside of the core of the cluster where the queen is, if there is brood, it will be 93 degrees all winter long. They keep it really warm. If there's no brood present, then it drops by about 10 degrees and will be 83 degrees, but they're really, really good at generating heat and keeping their colony warm as long as they're dry. And so you want to make sure if you're wrapping a bunch of stuff around your colony, you want to think if that's holding the moisture in or not. They can stay warm. They can't stay dry. So if you're trying to wrap them and keep them warm and it holds all that moisture in, you're actually going the opposite direction and maybe making things a little hard on them. So think carefully about wrapping too tightly. You know, you don't want to like completely wrap them up. Allow some space in there. And the last kind of cool thing here is it's kind of neat to know how bees generate heat. So in their thorax, which is what their wings are attached to. So they've got the head, and then the thorax is like the chest, and then they've got their abdomen. So where the wings are attached, they have two different sets of muscles. One goes vertically and one goes horizontally. So you've got a vertical set and a horizontal set of muscles inside of their chest. When they squeeze these vertical muscles here, then their wings flap. They buzz, it makes a buzzing noise, and their wings flap, so they fly. It generates heat, they fly. It's a very useful, functional thing in the summer. In the winter, if they were to buzz and flap their wings inside of the colony all winter long, it would wreck their wings. They wouldn't be able to fly by the time we got to spring. So what they do is they have another set of muscles that goes horizontally through their thorax, and they squeeze that, and it makes the same buzzing noise. It vibrates and it generates heat, but their wings stay folded down on their back. So I just think it's kind of cool how they stay warm. And look at that, we are exactly on time. So we might have a minute or two for questions if anybody has any questions.
Well, we don't have to be as restricted with time because we're moving into breakout rooms. So if there's more conversation that feels good in this section, then we can, relax a little bit about that. Anybody have
I'm never
questions?
sure if silence is good or bad. Oh, good. There's a question. Good. Toby?
Is that me? Hi.
Yes.
I was wondering, so with the homosote board, if the edges are exposed to the outside, which it looks like it might be, wouldn't it wick rainwater in and not be as able to pull the water out of the hive because it would be pulling rain in? Or how do you mitigate that?
If it was getting directly rained on, it would soak up all of that rainwater, but it's underneath the outer cover, which makes a kind of a drip ring around it. So unless it's raining completely sideways, it usually doesn't get to the edges. The other thing I like to do is the homosote board is kind of thin, so I always put 2 sheets on every hive, and so then I can open it up and look and see in the winter if it's dry in the middle, and if it is, I might flip it over and give them a dry side to help absorb moisture a little bit better. But that's a good question. If
do you put the 2 pieces right smack together, or do you put something in between them? Like, is there air in between them, or are they touching?
just two pieces flat together. Man Lake used to sell one that was 3/4 inch thick, and they went to the 1/2 inch thick, and the Homosoap board is 1/2 inch thick. And so I really think that 3/4 inch to a full inch is a little better. And so I like to use 2 sheets. And if it gets really damp, like last year, some of the boards got a little moldy. So there was a ring, about half of it was wet, but there was still a dry inside part that, could still pull moisture out. And if needed, you can flip it over. But last year was such a wet, wet, cold year without much chance for evaporation.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Kit, do you want to
There's
take it away?
a hand up. Did we already answer that
there is?
chat? There-
That might be Toby.
I think it's mine, and
That was Toby. Okay.
I forget about that.
And the one thing that was, I guess no one's asking about 8-frame boxes or medium brood nests. So I guess everyone sort of understands that it all works in the same general way. No questions, so that's cool.
I have a question. My name is Robbie, and I'm wondering how you feel about candy boards as a separate addition to the top of the hive.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what I showed with the sugar blocks. So a candy board is just a different kind of sugar block, and I think they're really beneficial. Helps absorb moisture, helps feed them during the winter. So you would take a candy board and you would put it directly on top of the box that has the frames. So it would go bees, candy board, moisture control, insulation.
And the inner cover is dispensed with for the winter?
It depends. I use that pink insulation, the Pink Panther insulation. And if I put my outer cover directly on top of that insulation, there's no air going to get in there, and my inner cover is going to kind of mold and rot a little bit. So I do put when I have my piece of insulation there, I do put my inner cover on top of that to help protect my outer cover, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
I don't have those shallow boxes that you love, but I just use an empty Western box and put everything, but I have more air in there, which it's probably not ideal. I think those shallow ones are probably really cool, but the empty box is what I have, and that's what I've used, and it does the job okay. Just as
and I forgot to mention, if you don't have one of those deep inner covers or a candy board, and you're just putting the sugar directly on the frames, what you want to do is you want to use a shim. It's like I think it's called an emery shim. It's like 1 inch high, and it has a little opening on it. Then that gives you 1 inch where you lay down your newspapers and you put your sugar on top of that, and it also creates that upper entrance for them. And that's actually, before I went to these deep inner covers, that was the method I used. So directly on top of the top brood box would be a shim that would create a little bit of space, and then a piece of newspaper on top of that, and then dry sugar or candy blocks on top of that.
Wouldn't that let moisture in?
It's just the upper entrance. So it doesn't create a gap between the boxes. It's like a super thin box. It's 1 inch high, but without a bottom in it, if that makes sense. It's just a ring of wood. Okay, good.
Kind of like a frame. Kind of like a
it's
frame.
just a ring of. It's like an inner cover without the center in it. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank
And
you.
the sugar,
It's a
sugar absorbs the moisture in the air too.
Yeah.
What was that?
So the sugar absorbs the moisture in the air as well.
And if you have that upper entrance, you're creating convection, and it's moving the air from down below up above so that the moisture goes out that upper entrance.
And
Mhm.
tipping the hives is my secret weapon too. That way the drips fall forward instead of down in the event that I do get moisture, which you wouldn't get, I guess, following all those specifics, Dawn. But I didn't have my hives tipped the other day, and I opened the lid and there was moisture, and it was like, I got to get my system in place. The season kind of caught me. Believe it or not, it's not like we didn't have plenty of
Yeah,
time.
some people think that tipping,
Go ahead, Dawn.
sometimes the thought is that tipping the hive forward lets water run out the bottom. But actually, I think Kathy was the first one that taught me this. Actually, and what Kit just said is tipping it forward causes it to run forward on the roof and down the sides. So it really doesn't have anything to do with water pooling in the bottom of the hive. It has to do with keeping it from dripping into the colony in the middle.
And I think that tipping it forward came when I was first in beekeeping in 2000, because there were no screen bottom boards then. They were solid, and the water would just pool down in the bottom. But if you tipped it forward, then it would run out. So I don't think it's quite as critical now to tip them forward. But I mean, if
Wow.
you're doing it, I think it works, go for it.
Wow, interesting. Makes sense. Logic, you know how that logic thing.
Gets you every time.
Okay, so we can continue this winterizing the hive conversation. It's the second breakout room. And let's see, my list of 4 of them. I have the first room, I guess it doesn't matter that they're numbered just because they're there to choose, is for first year beaks. And then there's winterizing hive. Then there's one for sharing stories. You know how we all have these crazy things happen that we'd love to share and ask questions about, or just draw amazement for, which is fair. So I put that in there, and then the last one is I would love to host on what people might want from PSBA, and I will stay in that room until people don't have much to tell me, and then I'll join another room. So that's 4 rooms, and then you know, the conversation can move. It's not like this is a structure that is solid. Okay, so I'm gonna move to breakout rooms. I guess first I should say my meeting introductory moment is that I think, you know, we are PSBA, we're a 501c3 and a nonprofit, and we are totally run by volunteers. And we are a small group of leaders that is making everything come along year round. You know, the seasons change, and so does our priority. Early spring will be on teaching, and then we move into working in the apiary. And neighborhood captains is an offer that we have year round that is important, that everybody has someone to sort of talk to when they have a question. And that neighborhood captain structure that we have in the club is really critical. We would love for people with a bit of experience and interest in talking bees with people who are just asking questions, direct people to, we need more neighborhood captains to direct people to where to find information, or just give them a sounding board. If there are those on the meeting tonight who would love to step into that role, it would sure be appreciated. Spread the wealth, if you will. What else? We have board meetings 4 times a year. The trustees are those people who really give us the support, more interest in taking on projects. Someone may have an interest in pollinator trees or working with the city on that. That's a project we've talked about. There are a number of things that people come to the club with curiosity and getting started with. And so we welcome that. Anyway, my bottom line is that I hope that you'll join us in November on the 15th for our annual potluck, which will be at the Arboretum, which is where we've always held that meeting. And we will also set it up virtually so that it's a two-way setup. You won't get to enjoy the potluck, but you'll be present with us and be a part of the voting group as we move into 2023's board and trustees. Join us, even if you're not really, even if you're not interested in a position, you're sure welcome. And I've asked about neighborhood captains, and that is probably the priority. Come to the board meeting. You're welcome. We would love to see you there. I'll send out more information about that as we get closer, of course. Anything else I should be reminding people about? Let's move to breakout, and just have to click this button. It's all set up. And you can select.
You might want to stop recording at this point too.
Thank you.